I'm going to mostly let Jim and Alex run the panel, but we'll take questions at the end. We're here to discuss what happens when the law enters the story. Jim?
Hi, are we introducing ourselves?
Yes, introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, I'm Jim Thompson. I taught genre theory for Duke University for 15 years, but I'm also a divorce lawyer, and so after, if anybody needs anything. And I also have, Alex and I do the Comic Book Historians podcast and the Facebook group with like 10,000 members, and I'll let Alex say more about that, but thanks for coming.
I'm Daniel Barrer. I'm a partner with the law firm of Pollock, Vida and Barrer in Los Angeles. I've been practicing law for close to 30 years. I've been a comic book fan for much longer than that. This is my 30th consecutive San Diego Comic-Con. There's been a couple before that, so I'm very appreciative of the 50th anniversary of the 50th Comic-Con. It's not the 50th anniversary because there was 2 in 1 year. Lawyers care about that sort of thing. And I am not a comic book historian. I am a fan of comic book histories and am privileged to participate in the Comic Book Historians Facebook page.
And I'm Alex Grand. Me and Jim run the Comic Book Historians Facebook group. I run the Comic Book Historians YouTube channel, and we co-host the podcast together, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm Mark Greenberg. I'm a late add-on to today's panel. I'm a law professor at Golden Gate University School of Law in San Francisco, the founder of the IP Law program there, and I'm closing in on 40 years in practice, most of which has been working in entertainment law. These days I represent a variety of comic artists in principally working on the transition of their works from the comics to film and television.
Okay, so let's start by looking at what a cease and desist letter is, and then we'll get to the point of it. It's basically the simplest and cheapest way for you to get somebody to stop doing something that you don't want them to do. Without suing them, simply having a lawyer send a letter saying, cut it out. I wanted to, instead of opening with a joke, I wanted to open with a perfect example of a cease and desist letter, which would be Shia LaBeouf when and I said not a joke, but of course I am making a joke here. Shia LaBeouf did a film called HowardCantor.com, which it turned out, as people realized immediately, was actually almost word for word taken from a Daniel Klaus work. And then LaBeouf apologized by writing a tweet explaining all of this, except that turned out to also be plagiarism. It was taken from a Yahoo Answers page asking about Picasso. From there, it got worse. He went on and skywrote, I am sorry, Daniel Klaus, which didn't carry a whole lot of weight. And then he got angry about it and posted the storyboard for my next short is Daniel Boring, based upon David Boring by Klaus. And it's like Fassbender meets Half-Baked Nabokov on Gilligan's Island, which of course was taken word for word from how Daniel Klaus described David Boring. That's where somebody finally says enough is enough and writes a cease and desist letter to his lawyer saying, you gotta cut out the crazy. Which of course he cannot do, and instead put a bag over his head. And that's how it's supposed to work. What we're talking about today is not that. What we're going to be talking about is when cease and desist becomes change and discuss. When the lawyer sends a letter and actually becomes part of almost a co-creator to what happens next in the comic. Not willingly, but nevertheless, he's an influence on the actual diegesis, on the narrative. The first example, and probably the best example ever of that, would be the pantsing of Howard the Duck, which Alex is going to tell us about.
So Howard the Duck was created by Steve Gerber and Val Myrick in 1973. So that's the panel on the left, and you can tell, there are no pants. but he has a particular look to him that it doesn't look like other characters. But in 1976, Howard was redesigned by Frank Bruner to look more like Donald Duck. And so that characteristic becomes more obvious on that image on the right, on the cover of Howard the Duck 1. So in the 70s, Disney Comics didn't sell as well in the United States through Western publishing as it did through the 40s through 60s Dell Comics that used to come out. So there was probably less of a hunger for the more wholesome comics then. However, those Donald Duck comics sold really well in Europe still. And the problem was when those new Howard the Duck comics were coming out, there was brand confusion in the marketplace where people it was felt that people were confusing the two characters and that the Howard the Duck character was encroaching on the customer base for the Donald Duck comics. So the European division of Disney complained to the United States Disney legal department about this confusion in their marketplace. So in 1970, and this happened in 1977, and so then Disney sends a cease and desist letter to Marvel with suggested redesigns of what Howard should look like.
Yes, I would just point out, these are actually done by the Disney artist. It was included with the letter saying, this is how you should do it. Danny's now going to tell us and unfortunately we could not find a copy of the actual letter that was written to Marvel, just the pages that were attached. But Danny's going to talk about the legal aspect of what such a cease and desist letter would be.
And before he does, just to point out that they point out not just pants, but also eye color, the shape of the bill. They said, don't make his eyes blue, just make him brown from now on. So they were very specific about Howard overall.
Well, cease and desist letters are generally the first contact between what you can call the superior user or the senior user, whoever the first owner of the copyright or trademark or other intellectual property is, and the person who's allegedly infringing. And there's a few aspects of cease and desist letters that come in here. Now, this is a letter from Disney, which is as big a conglomerate as you can find in the entertainment world, to Marvel, which at this point, before it was bought by Disney, was pretty small outfit that the common thread they both had is both of their stocks in trade were intellectual property. They had to protect their copyrights and trademarks from one another. Here you've got the concept of a funny animal duck, a smart aleck one. That's not necessarily unique. Daffy Duck, there's nobody would confuse Donald and Daffy, one of them speaks better than the other. But here you see Howard was getting closer to Donald Duck, who had had a big presence in comic books for the several decades before this. And in particular, the first story Frank Bruner did with a solo story with Howard, he had a tribute to Carl Barks. Now, Disney probably figured nobody knows who Carl Barks is, and that's okay. But it was, as Alex said, it's getting closer. And when Howard's just a one-off character, that's not necessarily within Disney's purview. It's just appears a couple times in Man-Thing comics, so what? If he's in a comic book series with him on the cover, that gets a little bit more serious. Now, cease and desist letters can tell somebody to just stop it. Stop using that or I'll sue you. They can also be a prelude to a deal. You could say, well, you're using this character, maybe we can work together, maybe if you want to keep using him, just pay us, we'll license it to you. This is a unique situation where Disney is not saying, don't stop publishing Howard the Duck. They're saying, you can publish it, but we'd like to have a little bit more control over it so it doesn't edge over into people confusing it with Donald Duck, so we're going to redesign him for you. I don't know of another situation. There's probably other situations like this, but it's just extraordinary to tell an outfit that lives by its images, Marvel, change the image so we don't sue you. And does this have any influence? Well, first of all, it's Disney, so they can probably outfight anybody in court. They don't want this to get into court. But as you get more and more into having a comic book series of a character who looks a lot like Donald Duck, there is some danger there.
So what happens once they get the directions is that John Romita says, okay, with no thought, no resistance at all, what Steve Gerber thought was completely cowardly and was furious about it. Steve Gerber is the writer of Howard the Duck and creator of Howard the Duck. But Romita and Reseverin just issue memos saying, okay, from now on, draw it like this, and presents the Disney pages. And that's what they're supposed to do. Steve Gerber doesn't go along with that very well. And in fact, in issue 21 in 1978, shortly thereafter, he writes a story putting the changes into effect and putting the pants on, but he makes it into, again, it becomes part of the narrative, but the narrative is that there's this evil pressure group, and they're called the Savior Offspring from Indecency, Sufi. And Sufi wants to incorporate Howard the Duck into being one of their allies for suppression, but first they need to have Howard be blanderized. And they put Howard into this washing machine, and it doesn't take. I mean, he comes out, but then the final step, they put him in this washing machine, and he's still not convinced, and he rebels. And as you can see in the last panel, he takes his pants off, and he walks away, and he says, in that case, how you just keep on trying, and I'll just keep on resisting, and we'll both have a lot of cloudy days ahead. Wow. Now, one thing that I don't know that you can see from the slides, but who Sufi turns out to be, it's a giant orange, and this is going to only be gotten by older people in the audience, but this is actually Anita Bryant. And she's the villain in this as he cracks open her orange. Now, some artists followed this pretty regularly, the new rules, and some didn't pay very much attention to it at all. There's a better shot of the orange being broken and Howard walking away at the end. Gerber didn't leave at that point. But Howard the Duck did. His magazine was canceled, his comic book was canceled about a year later and brought in as instead as a black and white magazine to get a more adult feel to it. Gerber was already long gone by this. Alex, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Gerber left Marvel. He was fired for not meeting deadlines. That was the official story. There was some discussion about the new editor-in-chief at the time wanting to get rid of the writer-editor arrangement, where the writer had total control over their books. So for a couple of those reasons, Gerber left Marvel Comics and then went over to work with Hanna-Barbera Comics and Thunder the Barbarian Cartoons, where he had some association with Jack Kirby. And that starts off a whole interesting discussion where Jack Kirby also had his own adversarial relationship with Marvel Comics, and they end up coming into a project together, a legal project, a creative project to get Howard back from Marvel so Steve Gerber could control him again.
But meanwhile, Bill Mantlo is given control over Howard the Duck and writes, and he doesn't like this any better than Steve Gerber did in terms of the pants, and he writes this story where that's even more directed at Walt Disney itself. In that one, Howard and Beverly are hounded at the mall again by a demonstration for decency, but they find refuge in the offices of a Wally Sidney, which is Walt Disney, only switched around, who actually persuades Howard to put on pants and makes an agreement. At the same time, around this time, Disney's had enough of this and sends a second letter, and they reach an actual agreement. And a lot of Marvel people, unlike the first time, this time the artists just thought it was a handshake kind of agreement, but there's actually a written agreement that says in more detail how Howard is going to be portrayed. And the interesting part about it was it included that Marvel was precluded from redesigning the duck again in any way. It has to be the model that they had agreed on originally. When Gerber came back in 2002 to do a mini-series on Howard, he found this out for the first time because he wanted to do a different version of Howard the Duck. Anyway, what Howard the Duck did, what Gerber did in that was he took the character and he said, well, if I can't change him as a duck, instead I'm going to make him into a different animal entirely, because Disney can't complain about that, and that's not the agreement. So that 8-issue miniseries in 2002, where in the very front cover, Howard turns into a mouse. Well, that's, again, it's an example of the way this goes and becomes part of the narrative, but the narrative there is also basically to give a middle finger to Disney by turning Howard into actually a mouse instead of a duck. Now, back to Howard.
Jack Kirby teams up with Steve Gerber to make the Destroy Your Duck comic book as a lawsuit edition, and at the same time, Dave and Danny Sim put together a portfolio called Friends of Old Gerber, and Friends of Old Gerber had different Destroy Your Duck images inked by a lot of a variety of people, and that built up about 20% of the money needed for the lawsuit to get control of the Howard character, and it ended up settling out of court. Cost $140,000 for Steve Gerber, and Disney ended up getting control of the character, but Steve Gerber got some money as well as a piece of the Howard the Duck movie, which bombed at the box office. But in the midst of all that, the Destroy Your Duck comic becomes, and Jim's going to talk about that, is the story of Destroy Your Duck is essentially a fictionalized form of Steve Gerber's quest to get Howard back.
Danny, why don't you talk a little bit about, since they're doing this as parody of Destroy Your Duck, how is that different from the earlier example, and why didn't it have a cease and desist letter?
Certainly, Destroy Your Duck was definitely meant both as satire, which is social criticism as humor standing alone from any source material, and parody. Parody is a form of fair use, and if you were at the panel before this one, you heard all about fair use. I'm not going to go into depth into it. Fair use is essentially you take a portion of a copyrighted or trademark, generally copyrighted work, and you incorporate it into a new work in such a way that it's transformative. The most common form is if you do a review of a comic book, for instance, and you have some pictures from the comic book, that's fair use. You're using it as part of a new work that's commentary and it's transformative. Can't be mistaken for copying the original work. But the fair use statute also permits commercial use as a fair use. Now, how much you can take from an original work and turn it into a new work that is not infringing, but in fact can be protected by a separate copyright, the courts are clear. There's no bright lines. It's a case-by-case decision. And so you never know. It may come down to who can make a better argument. It can come down to who has more money, who can hire better lawyers, etc. So anybody tries to tell you that fair use, parody, etc. are easy, they're lying. They'll probably tell you that whatever they're doing is fair use. Parody is a type of fair use. Parody is where you want to take a portion of a pre-existing work and copy it, but you're doing so as a commentary on the original. So the courts say it can be in bad taste, that doesn't matter. It can kill the market for the original by ridiculing that existence, that doesn't matter, it's still protected. The question is it just taking enough so that it's commenting on it, or is it taking so much that they're avoiding the drudgery of coming up with something new, or they're just calling attention to themselves? Now, if you look at Destroy Your Duck, it's got lots of parody in it. It's got a parody of Jim Shooter, it's got a parody of John Byrne, it's got a parody of every corporation by having the grab it all, own it all, drain it all, or God Corp. And they're all parodies of existing things, but they're all, to the extent they're taking something like Howard the Duck, they're transforming it so much that it is a unique work. Nobody could look at Destroyer Duck and mistake it for Howard the Duck or Donald Duck. It has been Jack Kirbyfied completely beyond that. There is a character in there called the Little Guy, who is a lot like Howard the Duck, who dies a few panels into the first issue. But that's a small enough piece of a copyrighted work that it's not going to upset anybody. It's clearly parody, it's clearly protected. So this is not generally going to generate any cease and desist letters as to copyright and trademark. Maybe slander or false light or something like that, but that's another panel.
And again, what you have is, because of the history of this and the involvement of lawyers, this is a character in a comic that is almost the direct product of this legal battle. It's also interesting, I think, in this context, that it's brought about, as I said, from that legal battle, and its only purpose is the parody of it. And then we go to almost another, it's not quite a byproduct of it, but it's interesting because in Destroy Your Duck, Marvel becomes the villain in the story. And then that plays out almost in real life, at least in Dave Sim's mind, as we'll see. Now Alex is going to talk about that.
So again, we're talking about parody, and it's tough to get a clear threshold on when it's no longer parody and it's encroaching on a copyright. But something that a lot of lawyers can agree on is that parody is legally okay if you're using a non-licensed character's likeness one time for some sort of entertainment, making fun of value. But sometimes that limit is stretched a bit. And so we see Dave Sim, he had a character in Cerebus called the Roach, and this Roach would take on different personas. A lot of them were Marvel characters. So we have an example on the top left where you see the Roach character putting on a Captain America costume, but he also has Cerebus on the cover, and there's a bit of parody. They kind of make fun of the Captain America persona. Then you go to the next character that the Roach character impersonates, and that was Moon Knight. And you see that there were 3 non-consecutive issues, and you see that Cerebus is on one of the covers, and it wasn't consecutive, but technically Moon Knight's the only character on the cover, so is that misrepresentation? Is that using Moon Knight to sell Cerebus? Maybe. But then we go to the next panel, or the next slide, and you see that 3 consecutive issues in a row, he had the Roach character dressed up like Wolverine. You don't see Cerebus on any of the covers, and it's almost like that Frank Miller Wolverine type of imagery on 3 consecutive issues. And something that was noted was sales of each issue were really high, unusually high for Cerebus. So then Marvel sends Dave Sim a cease and desist letter for using their Wolverine character.
Which I just want to add that what becomes interesting about that is, unlike the earlier Howard the Duck one, we are privy to this. And the reason is because Sim puts it in the letters page, which I should have mentioned. LaBeouf does the same thing. He tweets in the example I gave, when he got that cease and desist, he tweeted it. So Dave Sim was like an early version of Shia LaBeouf in some ways. So let's talk about.
Certainly, there's a couple of legal concepts that come into play here. One of them is fair use and parody. Another is, what do you do when somebody is potentially infringing on your copyright, and you don't necessarily want to mess with them? Maybe you're at Marvel and you like what Dave Sim is doing with Cerebus. Maybe you're concerned about bad press if you try to come down on him. But if you've got intellectual property, you have to protect it. So there's a couple of concepts that are counterparts of each other that are affirmative defenses to a copyright or trademark lawsuit. One of them is called laches, which always sounds to me like potato pancakes with cheese. but it's essentially you snooze, you lose. If you have rights, you don't assert them, you wait to assert them. You're sleeping on your rights, as the law says. And meanwhile, the other side, the person who might sue, is just going on and on with it to the point where if you told them to stop, you'd prejudice them, you'd mess them up because you waited too long, then you can't assert your rights. That's laches. The other side is acquiescence, which is a version of another legal concept, which I really like this word, estoppel. Acquiescence is if you act or speak in such a way that you are conveying the impression that you're okay with this use of your copyright or trademark. If you, for instance, as Marvel allowed Howard the Duck to go forward with some redesigns, if they didn't act after that, if they went back on that, they could be seen as acquiescing in what they were doing. If you are conveying to the junior user, the person who's allegedly infringing, that you're allowing it to go forward and they rely on your statements and lack of action to enforce your rights to the detriment, if you waited too long to enforce it, then you might not have a case. So that's why Marvel, seeing Dave Sim use Wolverroach, not just as an incidental character, but on 3 consecutive covers, would send a cease and desist letter, and they're not just being mean corporate bad guys, they are trying to protect what is, at this point, Marvel's bread and butter, the Wolverine character. Parody, as I said, if it's done to comment on the original, and you're taking a portion of the protected work to comment on that protected work, that's fine, that's protected. If you're using it just to sell your product, because you're not coming up with something new, you're just latching onto something popular and pasting it onto your product, that's a lot less defensible. So it seems to me that Marvel's in a pretty good position here that Sim is overusing this parody to sell his product, and maybe whether or not they win in court, it's a good idea to send a cease and desist letter. That brings up another point, my last point before we go to something entertaining, which is that cease and desist letters aren't always backed up by the law. There's rules, such as Federal Rule 11, which say that you can't file a lawsuit that isn't backed up in some good faith way by the law and the facts. Cease and desist letter, you can represent anything you want. You can not have a leg to stand on and act like you're sitting pretty. You can misrepresent the law, you can misrepresent the facts, etc. And if the person it's sent to doesn't know any better, they can be crushed. That's why cease and desist letters, sometimes they've got merit and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they have a bark which is worse than the potential eventual bite.
So unlike the Howard the Duck example, no stories get written, incorporated into the Cerebus narrative because of the cease and desist. But comments have changed at this point, and Cerebus is a very different book from a Marvel Howard the Duck in that it's one person and he gets to call the shots. So what Sim does at this point is his letter pages are as much a part of the book as the narrative is. And this becomes a major issue within the letters pages of Cerebus. He doesn't just quote, he prints the entire cease and desist letter, but he goes into great detail about how Denny, notice it doesn't say Mr. Sim, it says Miss Sim, because Denny Lambert is the publisher or the editor of it at the time. And so she acquiesces immediately and says, "Oh, we won't do that again. We'll move on and not do Wolverroach." And David doesn't agree. He's outraged at it. In fact, he responds doing something for a fan in that way. But so this dissension between he and his wife plays out on the letters page to some degree. This is shortly before they actually split. So we have this narrative going on as a result of people like us, of lawyers, who feed this, and then we see it played out on the letters pages and as part of what is developing as the Dave Sim personality that comes into play more and more as the comic goes on. But that's not the only thing, because it does play in terms of a narrative and a creation, but not by Dave Sim. Marvel has some fun with this in terms of the creation of Spider-Ham. Now, look at who comes out around the same, shortly after this. If you look at it, this is Cerebus in a spider suit, basically. And so what Marvel is saying is, well, how do you like it when you get this treatment? And they stick Cerebus in a spider costume and it runs for 10 issues or more, and is a beloved character sort of even to this day. Sim thought it was pretty neat. He thought, that's a good way, much better than sending lawyers in. This is poking fun at me, and I actually think that's interesting. So when Ultimate Spider-Man hits 100, Dave Sim volunteers to do a variant cover where, I don't know if you can see on the right side is Sim's cover, where he puts Cerebus in the spider suit as Spider-Ham. And so we again have an example of how it moves over into the ripple effect of actually being in the comics world.
So now Mark Greenberg is an attorney that deals with a lot of these things, and so we're glad to have him. And we'd like to hear your perspective on the cease and desist and how it can be used as far as creativity, intimidation, and all these other concepts.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up a little bit on what Dan said, and that has to do with the use. It's often referred to as the strategic use of cease and desist letters. So oftentimes, one of the things that I've seen a lot of is you get a cease and desist letter regarding trademark. And the party says, you violated my trademark, you're infringing my trademark, I'm going to sue you into the Stone Age. And the first thing I do is I contact the trademark office and do the research and find out if they actually have a registered trademark, and about 50% of the time they don't. It's a bluff. Similarly, we've had situations where a copyright is about to expire or has in fact expired, and the prior holder of that copyright sends a cease and desist letter and says, I hold the copyright. Well, you did, but you no longer do. So the sort of the lesson, the takeaway from that is, if you get an assertion that somebody is a copyright holder or a trademark holder, and they're sending a cease and desist letter, double check what they've actually said. Is what they've said actually true? Or in fact, is it a case where they are bluffing or advancing an effort to try to protect rights that they don't have? I've been watching with great interest something that I'm not sure that this is the reason, but I noticed a couple of years ago that the Disney company started using a film clip, a little animation clip of Steamboat Willie as a brand. And I think that's great that they want to identify that, but I wonder if that's motivated in part by the upcoming expiration of Mickey Mouse's copyright. And one of the areas that is a lot of debate among IP lawyers is, can you migrate your copyright rights into trademark and try to get an extended run of protection, since copyright does ultimately expire, whereas trademark does not. So there's some interesting things that you have to pay attention to in these contexts. And so one of the things I've seen sort of on the other side of this as a strategic use is some companies actually take the position that receiving, particularly small companies, that receiving a cease and desist from a large corporation is a badge of honor. And so it gets posted on their website and publicized extensively. Hey, guess what? Big company A, B, or C just sent us a cease and desist letter. Here it is, and it's held up for ridicule. So companies have to be careful in terms of what kind of publicity they're going to get. when they send out a cease and desist letter, it's no longer viewed as a private communication between parties. It's going to be available or posted for the general public. So that kind of leads me I wanted to add just one or two comments on the subject of working with lawyers and in the context of cease and desist letters. So the first question that comes up sometimes is, when you get a cease and desist letter, should you hire a lawyer to help with the response? And I've been a big believer all along in what I refer to as holistic law. Try to get in there early and get a hold of something before it gets out of control. Ignoring the cease and desist letter will, in at least half of the cases, ultimately lead to you getting sued. And that ends up being a much more expensive proposition. So the holistic law context is get a hold of an attorney up front quickly, because oftentimes the cease and desist letter, as has been the point in this panel, is used really to initiate a discussion, possibly sometimes to reach some kind of a modification. This happens a lot in trademarks. I'll give you one quick example of this. Some years ago, I represented a record label called TNT Records. And TNT Records was Digital Underground, the Humpty Dance, that kind of stuff. That was their genre, rap and hip hop. And I filed a trademark registration for TNT Records, and I got a call from Turner Network Television. And they said, "You can't use TNT. We own TNT." And I said, "Really? Ted Turner's going into rap and hip hop? Cool, that's news." I said, "Well, no." And as the dialogue went forward, we ultimately reached a resolution in which we said, we won't go into television or anything that Turner does. You guys agree you won't go into rap and hip hop, and we'll continue to use this trademark, but we'll limit it just to this kind of genre. That was a good workout. So oftentimes, that cease and desist letter can be a precursor to a negotiated settlement, but you're not going to know that if you ignore it or do duck and cover, and then the company figures, well, they don't want to negotiate, I guess we got to sue them. And so a lawsuit ends up getting filed out of a misunderstanding. And that would be really a negative.
I want to add something to that, because that's a perfect example of this. There was a few years ago, Vertigo sent a letter to a creator, Andrea Grant, because she was using a character named Minx, and they had a Peter Milligan series. And what she said, this was in an interview, she said, "I received a very polite cease and desist letter a few weeks ago saying they had trademarked the word Minx, and they'd like for me not to use it in my title." She did a couple of things, and then they worked out something. And she said, "I have my lawyers dealing it. They're communicating with DC and sent a letter out today, so that's nice. And I guess there's been a little flurry in the press, so just so DC knows, I'm not completely willing to cave in." This happens all the time. A lot of creators get these kinds of letters. I'm not the only one. A lot of writers and artists are very confused about the difference between copyright and trademark, and the laws, of course, vary from country to country. A lot of people get these letters and get nervous and give up. I'm fortunate to have good lawyers, and Minx is something I've been using for a very long time. You can't trademark something and then not use it for many years. You can't just buy out every title you think one day might want to do something. So I thought that was a great capsule of that.
Yeah, it's exactly the point. Is unfortunately, and there's an awful lot of discussion about this, lawyers are expensive. But in a lot of these contexts, you know, it's that holistic law concept I'm talking about. And I tell clients all the time, you can pay me now to help negotiate a resolution of a case, and I'll buy a suit or two. And unlike how I dress for Comic-Con, I like fancy suits. Or you can pay me when the case goes into litigation, and I'll buy a car, and if it goes to appeal, I'll buy a house. I like nice suits, I like houses, up to you. So it really makes sense to try to avail yourself of the legal resources as quickly as you can. And also, at least in California, we have California Lawyers for the Arts, which is a nonprofit organization that helps artists deal with issues like this. And so it's really worthwhile getting that help as quickly as possible. If you are going to do this, though, one other cautionary word I would express with respect to getting an attorney to respond to a cease and desist letter. The entertainment law business is a really attractive, fun area to work in. So lots of lawyers want to do this, and there's lots of wannabe entertainment lawyers out there who haven't really got the experience to do the work. And I can tell you from personal experience, it often helps if you're working with an entertainment lawyer who is known in the industry and has a reputation, you will get a better result. So vet your lawyers at least as carefully as you vet the people who cut your hair. Do a little research, find out whether the person has experience and is somebody that can really help you. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions, and don't just think about the legal aspect of it, but think about the narrative aspect too, and the interplay between the two. Yes?
Did Disney ever have anything to say about MLJ's Super Duck? Is it a piece that's similar to Donald as Howard?
I don't know the answer to that, but I would say Disney was very, very sensitive to its characters at that time, partially because Howard wasn't the first thing to ruffle their feathers. But the thing about it was they had come off of the Air Pirates issue, and also Wally Wood's infamous picture. So they had gotten slapped in the face a couple of times. So even though Howard wasn't as offensive, they were going to kind of let it go, but the European division just couldn't handle it. They were actually in competition with Howard the Duck, so it became a money issue more than anything else with the Marvel one. Oh, okay, in the written.
You brought up a point about putting up a cease and desist letter on a website or publishing it. Nowadays with emails, and there's a confidentiality notice on the bottom, is it still okay to go ahead and just put a cease and desist letter on Facebook or something like that without getting sued by the attorneys who sent it?
I would say it's perfectly okay. I think we're all in agreement on that.
Once in a while, lawyers attempt to register copyright in their work. I have seen that happen with some briefing, but it's kind of a tough road to go because you're, even in the brief context, you're sending this out to a third party. And particularly in the cease and desist context, you don't have a confidentiality agreement with that party. So no, I think people can go ahead and post them. I've not seen anybody try to sue somebody who posted it for violating any kind of confidentiality.
If it then turns into settlement negotiations back and forth, that's a different thing. That is confidential, and a lawyer can get sanctioned for it.
And a good lawyer will send a notice of confidentiality as a header on the letter, on the subject letter.
But not a cease and desist.
No, right. Thank you.
Going back to Disney providing Howard the Duck with a new image, did that, at any point, did that mean that Disney would now own the new Howard the Duck? I mean, that sounds very weird to me.
Right.
They own it now?
Yeah, but at the time it was just to say comply with these and we won't pursue any further action. And John Romita Sr. felt it was really convenient actually. He acquiesced immediately and said, hey, this is great. They gave us this. So we're just going to do it like this and stay out of trouble. So it wasn't that Disney owned it. But what is funny is if you see Howard's image in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie at the end, he's kind of a weird looking Howard. Like he's got the pants and his bill's all weird. Like, so you almost kind of think like they have long-term memory on this image. And there it is for everyone to see that this is actually the official Howard the Duck now. And I think that's funny how similar that Howard is to that 1970s letter.
Plus, they really, really don't want him to look like Donald Duck.
Yeah.
You can now, that provision is defunct because of the purchase of Disney. So now you can do a Howard the Duck that looks as ugly as that, and it's okay. But before that, this was the Howard the Duck, and that's why Gerber turned him into a mouse.
Okay.
So a number of the major companies like Marvel actively embrace the fan out there. They have a Marvel book coming. series about major cosplayers and how they produce their costumes. They're running their own contest with prizes, and the costumes themselves may not be copyrightable, but a lot of the accoutrements, the decorations on them, the masks, those things are subject to copyright. But you're talking about latches and stopple. If they're actively encouraging the fan use of materials that go beyond purely available from fair use, would they have a difficult time trying to put it back into the box if there was like one particular instance where they didn't like one thing that somebody was doing?
Ask J.K. Rowling.
What I've seen is, as a growing trend from large entertainment companies, is they publish guidelines. And they say, these are the lines. If you want to do fan-created content, I find this of great interest. I'm currently writing a book on fandom and the law. If you want to create content based on our characters, here's what you can do, and here's what you can't do. And as long as you stay within the lines, it's fine. If you go outside the lines, we will sue you for copyright infringement. We won't sue you for violating our guidelines, because oftentimes the guidelines themselves arguably go beyond what fair use would allow. But it's here's the easy path, and here's the tough path. To quote the famous Clint Eastwood movie, do you feel lucky, punk? And so it then becomes a question of which direction you want to go. And so that's how they've responded to that, to the issue that you raised.
Yes.
If you guys are going to hire an entertainment lawyer, and you're looking through entertainment lawyers' resumes or whatever you guys do, are there any red flags that stick out that you would immediately be like, nope, not this guy?
Mark would know that.
Well, yeah, there's a wonderful website, at least in the state of California. We're very lucky, not all states have this. The state of California has calbar.org. Every lawyer in the state of California is required to provide the state bar with their name and address and stay in contact. So you can look up any lawyer in California on calbar.org, and one of the things that you will see is whether that lawyer has ever been disciplined by the state bar for. So just out of curiosity, the other day I looked up Michael Avenatti, and he currently has 2 state bar complaints going against him for violating client, I think it was appropriating client money.
Stealing.
So you can find out if a lawyer, I mean, that's the easiest way to find a red flag. If the lawyer's been disciplined or had a problem with the bar, an ethical or professional problem, it will show up on calbar.org.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would a public persona, like an actual person as compared to a creative character, be considered their trademark, their brand, or would it be more of a copyright? So with Stormy Daniels, it's kind of her own brand by just being herself. So if you go to work with a person who is the brand, so to speak, what kind of issues?
Well, let's write a publicity law. That goes into the area of what's called right of publicity law. People who are celebrities or even semi-celebrities. My friend Danny Fingeroff once had a great phrase, niche celebrity, which I thought was a marvelous concept. If you're in any of those categories and someone appropriates your name, image, or likeness, in California you have a protectable right that you can bring action for. And it's just by the same token, any actor or actress who gets involved in a project signs away their rights of publicity to the production company for that particular production. There's a whole body of law on right of publicity that's involved in that.
Okay, we have to stop. I'm going to thank everybody, the panel.